Second scripture lesson is found in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter number 12, beginning in verse number 29. These are the words of Jesus. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. Father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? May God again bless the reading and hearing of this word, and may we hear in it a word that is to us and for us on this day. When I was somewhere, say in my mid-40s, I found myself needing a new car. I'd spent my earlier life as an adult driving the cars that were demanded by my station in life. I'd tootled around in a Subaru wagon and a couple of minivans. I announced to anyone who had listened that the time had come for a change and that I was going to buy myself a pickup truck. No more borrowing my friend Earl's truck when I needed to haul some mulch or move something. Having made this solemn declaration to anybody that would listen over a weekend, I headed out on Monday to the car dealership to buy a pickup truck. Someone, of course, approached me there in the parking lot as soon as I arrived, and I asked them for a little bit of space so I could just look around a little bit. I was walking over to the section where the collection of pickup trucks were, and something caught the corner of my eye. It wasn't something I was looking for. It was a shiny white Sebring convertible. It so arrested my attention that I decided to take a detour and to go over and to take a look. The closer I got, the shinier and the whiter and the cooler it was looking. And so I did what any reasonable man who was in the requisite age for a midlife crisis would do. I asked that the salesman give me less space now and bring me the keys so I could take that for a test drive. As I was driving, I remembered some advice my dad had given me much earlier in life, essentially advised that I should never buy a convertible because in his thinking they didn't hold their trade value. That's the kind of advice my dad often gave me. As I was considering his advice, I was also considering how cool the car looked. And if I'm telling the entire truth, well, I thought I looked pretty cool in it. And so I did what any reasonable person shopping for a pickup truck would do. I purchased the white Sebring convertible. Then I drove it for several years until I traded it in, although it had not retained its trade value. Yeah, after all those years of hauling soccer and baseball equipment around in a minivan, I was ready for a change. And boy, was that a change. Let's talk a little bit about change. Acknowledging that sometimes we are ready for it and are looking for it and are seeking it, and sometimes we just resist it. Now, to our text, is it just me or does Jesus seem like he's in a bad mood today in this gospel lesson? Perhaps he is tired, perhaps he is stressed. In fact, the text even uses a word that is translated in English as stress. Or perhaps, to my original point, he's just in a bad mood. I concluded my sermon last week with these words. Not that I need to remind you how I concluded my sermon last week. I'm sure that you remember it, but I'll refresh you. I concluded with these words: it has always been movements and not monuments which have stood in the face of darkness, hatred, and death, and have staked the peculiar claim that sacrificial love and a passionate commitment to peace are not simply a way, they are the way. I felt pretty good about that couple of sentences and its sentiment. And then I sat down this week and I read our Jesus. That's your Jesus and mine, saying this: do you think that I've come to bring peace to the earth? Well, yeah, I thought so. No, he says, I tell you, but rather division. Now, what are we to do when instead of lifting us up, Jesus' words make us uncomfortable? Well, I think we just sit in that discomfort and see where it might take us, and see what kind of transformation it might point us towards. Perhaps you have noted a small change in our worship service. It is small, but I bet the majority of you missed it. We no longer have a prayer titled the Prayer of Confession. Have you noticed? It's now titled the Prayer for Transformation and New Life. Now, just so you know, this was not my idea. The United Church of Christ on their website has a link called Worship Ways. And Worship Ways is a place where we often go on Sunday mornings to provide the liturgy that we use in our worship service. A few months ago, Worship Ways decided to change the name of the Prayer of Confession to the Prayer for Transformation and New Life. Well, at first, I resisted the change. The prayers themselves were essentially the same, but they had changed the name, and to tell you the truth, I didn't like it. Don't let the white convertible fool you. I can be old school about some things. And I initially got old school about this. By that I mean I had an internal conversation with myself, and in it I said, no, I don't want to change, and you, the UCC liturgy writers, you can't make me. Very mature, right? There's an often used story by preachers and public speakers about a man who lived in a small town and he turned 100. And the local paper there thought this was worthy of a feel-good newspaper story, and so they sent somebody out to interview him, and the reporter asked a question this way: in a century of living, I suppose you have seen a lot of change. And the man who had just turned 100 said, yeah, I've lived 100 years in this town, and I've seen a lot of things change. I've seen a lot of changes, and I was against every one of them. Well, that is about how I felt about them changing the name of the Prayer of Confession. I saw no need for a change. In fact, I'm not ashamed to say it. We've always called it the Prayer of Confession. That's just how we've always done it. So I'd take their Prayer for Transformation and New Life, copy and paste it underneath the Prayer of Confession. Still in an internal conversation with nobody but myself, I dug in my heels and I said, I don't want to change, and you just can't make me. And then one day, it hit me differently. Perhaps I looked at this world we are living in together and saw our planet with this gaping need for transformation and new life. That need is evident everywhere we look. It doesn't matter if we get our news at CNN or Fox. It doesn't matter if we're reading the New York Times or the Pinehurst Pilot. It's there. In his letter to the Romans, Paul speaks of creation groaning in labor pains, still waiting to become a thing, a place, a habitat that is not yet become. Ultimately, it occurred to me that a prayer for transformation and new life is precisely what we need, and where our hearts and our minds need to be when we gather as a worshiping community. It isn't simply that we seek a movement of the Spirit which brings change and transformation, but just as importantly, we seek a presence and a power which keeps our souls hopeful. So much of the anger and negativity we experience in our society is born from a paralyzing loss of hope. People on the other end of the theological spectrum are not our enemies. People on the other side of the political aisle are not our enemies. Our enemy is cynicism. Our enemy is resignation. Our enemies are those forces which erode hope and the belief that transformation and new life are possible. Our enemy is the untruth that what is, with all of its brokenness and division, is what always will be. Our enemy is any presence which erodes and diminishes the spiritual energy of Christ's church, which allows us to reach for higher ground and to climb for higher ground. Remember that great old hymn, we're pressing on the upward way, new heights we're gaining every day, still praying as we're upward bound. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Lord, lift us up and let us stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than we have found. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. This surly, discomforting Jesus we encounter in this passage, however, isn't just longing for change, isn't just announcing change. He is announcing that he will usher in the change through his very life and death. He speaks of baptism in an unusual way. There's nothing ceremonial in what he speaks of. There's nothing ritualistic about it. Instead, for Jesus, this baptism is an immersion into the suffering he must embrace to bring about change. For the better part of my career, I've practiced and sometimes had to defend the least invasive forms of baptism. Most of us, although not all of us, practice the sprinkling of adults and children and infants. And while I remain in that camp, there is something powerful in the symbolism of baptism by immersion. Not long ago, someone traveled to Johns River Valley camp to be baptized in that river, and I witnessed the events and couldn't help but be moved by the power of it. From my youth, I remember those Sunday evening services in which men and women and girls and boys wore their white robes as the pastor, who I imagine must have been very strong, immersed them in the water and then raised them to new life. In the first church that I served as an associate, we offered an option. And while most people chose to be sprinkled, the baptismal pool was still there for those who chose that manner. The first baptism I performed was of a young man, a boy really, somewhere around 10 years old. I met with him. I met with his parents who were concerned about his level of understanding. Eventually, however, we determined that he understood it as well as we did. My only compunction in the whole matter was that he was determined to be baptized by immersion. There are no classes in seminary regarding most of the practicalities of ministry, including the practicalities of baptism. I felt reasonably prepared, however, because I'd witnessed enough of this and even experienced it myself. When the day came, he was more nervous than he thought he would be, and I was just as nervous as I had thought I would be. All of those first come with anxiety. First sermons and first weddings and first funerals, and this my first baptism. As I prepped for it, I was both nervous about it being my first and nervous that it involved placing the head of a 10-year-old boy underwater. I would like to tell you that my fears were unfounded and that I performed a smooth and meaningful baptism. I didn't. Depending on one's interpretation, it might have been meaningful, but it wasn't smooth. I could sense his nerves, and well, he could probably sense mine. I got all of the liturgy right, but that turned out to be the easy part. When the moment arrived and I raised his hand to cover his nose and then my hand to cover his hand, as I began to lower him into the water and was already committed to the task, it was a sideways glance that he gave me, which alerted me to some pending problems. In his 10-year-old eyes, I saw fear. And if I interpreted that sideways glance right all those years ago, I think he might have been telling me, I've changed my mind. It was, however, too late. Even if I'd been more experienced, we were both committed and this thing was happening. Well, he first threw his legs up in the air as I immersed him, and then he flailed with his free arm and water splashed over the glass and down on the floor below. I'd not intended a long stay under the water for him, but shortened even those plans and pulled him and all of his flailing limbs out of the water as quickly as possible. He remained stunned and fearful for just a moment, apparently having believed for some fraction of a second that he was not going to survive this event. When he realized that he had not only survived, but was now newly baptized, that look evolved from fear to relief, ultimately even to joy. And he expressed his joy when he gained his footing, shook his head like a wet puppy, and he shouted, "Hot dog." To which somebody in the congregation shouted back, "Hot dog indeed." Now, maybe he was nervous because he was 10, or maybe in his 10-year-old mind, he could actually understand the import of what he was doing. To be baptized is not to gain entry into a life of ease and safety, but rather a life of challenge and climbing toward higher ground. The call of the church, which bears Christ's name, isn't a call away from the messiness of life, but a call to be immersed in it. I will close with this modern parable. He saw people love each other, and he saw that love made strenuous demands on the lovers. He saw love require sacrifice and self-denial. He saw love produce arguments and anguish, and he decided that it cost too much. He decided not to diminish his life with love. He saw people strive for distant and hazy goals. He saw men strive for success. He saw women strive for high ideals. He saw that striving was often mixed with disappointment, and he saw the strong fail. He saw that those who succeeded sometimes hadn't earned success, and he decided that it cost too much. He decided not to soil his life with striving. He saw people serving others. He saw people give money to the poor and helpless. He saw that the more they gave, the more the need grew. He saw ungrateful receivers turn on their giving and serving friends. He decided not to soil his life with serving. And when he died, he walked up to God and presented his life undiminished, unmarred, and unsoiled. His life was clean from the filth of the world, and he presented it proudly, saying, "This is my life." To which the great God responded, "What life?" In this changing world, in this world which yearns for transformation, may we go to that higher ground, into those messy places where the voice of the Spirit calls us, that we might bring change and that we might be change. Amen.